Hi, everyone. We are now ready to get started. So welcome and thank you very much for joining this webinar today, the last one of this year. So I'm really happy to be here and sharing this session. Today we'll be talking about adapting for resilience, practical strategies for business in a changing climate, which is a kind of key topic when we talk about climate risk and opportunities and finding the solutions to enhance resilience. So we could go to next slide. I'm Maria Sunyer. I'm a managing consultant at EcoAct, and I'll be chairing our session today. And I have with me three great panelists who will be talking about everything about adaptation, from what it is, emerging regulation, practical steps to get started, and some examples on how to implement it in practice. So we have Rylan, Morane, Senyarich, and Beatriz Marques, who will be taking us through these topics. Just to note that one of our panelists is having a bit of technical issues, and actually can see that she's joining now. But if there was any issues, we will be covering for her. Next slide. So we have a bit of a packed agenda today. We'll get started with a bit of an introduction and context into climate adaptation. Why is it critical for businesses, and why do we need to get started with this now? Then we'll move into emerging regulatory requirements, and Rylan will take us through that session. Then we'll move into practical steps for climate adaptation and examples on on-site approaches and how to use data and tools to support us in this journey through adaptations. We'll make sure to leave enough time for questions and answers at the end of the session. So if you could please write any questions you have using the QA functionality in Zoom, that could be great. And just a bit more of housekeeping before we get started. The session is being recorded, and we'll share this recording later on with all the participants today. So that will be available to everyone later on. So just to get us started on the topic and why climate adaptation is critical for the business today. You could, yeah. So we know there is a need to act now. There is two main reasons for this. One is physical risks are increasing. We have some examples here on what that might mean, but we've seen an increase in recent years and decades on climate disasters, causing great damages in terms of human life and economic losses, and impact basically on population, countries, and companies. And we know that countries are actually not sufficiently prepared to cope with this increasing risk. So two examples here from recent articles. One saying Europe is not prepared for rapidly growing climate risks. That's from this year. And also a similar one for UK not being fully prepared for the climate crisis and the physical risks that are coming. And I'm sure we could find examples of these in many other countries around the world. Just as an example of the size of the risk that we're facing and how this is increasing over time, there is a recent work that points to $2.3 trillion losses if we do nothing. So we continue business as usual from now to the end of the century. And a similar statistic on 4.4% of the world GDP could be lost annually. So these are big numbers in terms of economic losses, but we shouldn't forget how that impacts all of us and businesses. So basically, we know that the risk is increasing, that countries are not doing enough, and hence businesses have a key role to play in terms of preparing and adapting to future climate. If we could move to the next slide. So all we're talking about today is climate adaptation. So maybe we should start with a definition of what that is. Climate adaptation is the process of adjustment to current and projected impacts of climate change. So it's basically how do we prepare for what we know is impacting us now and what will impact us in the future. And why is this key for organizations to start preparing and thinking about? One is essential for business continuity. As mentioned just now, physical risks are already increasing. So if companies want to ensure that business continuity and not impacts on operations, then adaptation needs to be included within those plans. It's also an increase in requirement within this IFRS S2, CSRD, and TPT, and Rylan will tell us a bit more about this in a second. And lastly, adaptation has been typically thought as a cost to business, as something that people need to pay for, but actually it's there's no evidence that it's cost effective. And preparing now for the climate and the impacts that we suffer now and in the future is cost effective and can even present co-benefits if done properly. So hopefully that works as a bit of an introduction to the topic. Why is it important to prepare now, and why we need to start really thinking and acting on climate adaptation? And now I'll hand over to Rylan to tell us a bit more about emerging regulatory requirements.
Awesome, thank you. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So adaptation is an important component of regulated climate reporting today. And the reason is because company stakeholders want to see not just what a company's climate-related risks are, but also their plan to manage those risks and adapt the business to be more resilient in future operating conditions where the climate may look different than it is today. So there's 3 different categories or themes of adaptation requirements that cross-cut different regulatory frameworks. So these adaptation requirements are found in IFRS S2, SEC, California, CSRD, and TPT. And they're found most often in the strategy and risk metrics sections of those frameworks and regulations. So the 3 different categories or themes that we pulled out here today. Number 1 is, first of all, disclosures regarding a company's adaptation actions that the company is taking today, or actions that you as a company plan to take in the future. Second category is around the effectiveness of those adaptation actions, which is basically to say, what is the actual impact of the actions that you're taking, right? And how much of your risk profile or your asset portfolio is actually covered by those adaptation actions. And the third is your investment into adaptation actions. Basically, the amount of resources that you as an organization are dedicating towards your own adaptation actions and adaptation planning. So each framework and regulation has obviously very precise wording about exactly what is required, but generally all requirements fit within one of these 3 categories. So if you're looking for kind of a cheat sheet just to quickly understand what you should be working towards as an organization when it comes to adaptation, these 3 categories are a good way to think about it. So from here, I'll pass it to Morane to talk about practical steps for adaptation.
Morane, sorry, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Rylan. So now let's see the practical steps a company can take to get started with their climate adaptation. Next slide, please. First of all, when we talk about climate adaptation within a business, it would be good to look at what we're talking about exactly in practical terms. What does it mean for a business to adapt to climate adaptation? So we divide adaptation measures into 2 main categories, which respond to different sorts of vulnerabilities and different types of risks. These are the physical measures and the non-physical ones. Physical measures are physical interventions that are designed to provide protection for the business and infrastructure from climate hazards. And they can be gray infrastructure measures, also called hard measures, that can be, for example, strengthening a building. Green infrastructure or nature-based solutions that we hear a lot about lately, and that's, for example, green roofs or mangroves. And also blue infrastructure, which is related to water management, and that can be a pond or retention water system. And in terms of non-physical measures, here we're looking more at operations and strategy. So operational adaptation measures are related to how the operation of a business can be modified so that the climate resilience is enhanced. That's, for example, implementing early warning systems in case of extreme weather events, or improving the flexibility of how business is operated so that it can respond to changing conditions. And for the strategy here, what we're trying to do is to embed climate adaptation within all the business processes and the governance so that we make sure there are people accountable for improving climate adaptation in the business. And that's, for example, making sure that the financial decision-making process and financial planning is aligned with the overall adaptation goal of the business. So if we move to the next slide, please. It's good to mention that when deciding on which of these adaptation measures a business will implement, there can be resistance related to the fact that they have a cost, but the benefit is not always sure because climate projections are uncertain, and therefore the impacts of climate risks are uncertain. But this should not be a cause for inaction because there are actually safe ways to get started with climate adaptation, and that's to prioritize measures that have other benefits. So we define them in 3 terms. These sort of measures can be no regrets. This means that with this action you're taking in your business, there will be other benefits regardless of what sort of future climate we're facing. That can be, for example, implementing a water leakage reduction scheme that will generate savings. There are also win-win measures that benefit climate resilience, but also other aspects and can contribute to other business goals. So that can be adding value to society or improving other environmental aspects for the business. And finally, it's also good to look at flexible or adaptive management options, which can be adjusted in the future in case conditions do not reflect what was originally projected. These measures can be modified at a low cost. Next slide, please. Yeah, great. So the identification of the adaptation measures to be developed by a business should be part of a bigger adaptation planning process, which needs to be thorough and always start with the risk assessment step. So this way the company can clearly understand what climate risks it is exposed to, and also quantify their potential impact to then target the risks that are most material. It's the most logical thing to say to prioritize the adaptation action, basically. And it's also key to prioritize some sites or products the business wants to act on first, to not spread themselves too thin and do some pilot projects it can then roll out. Once the material risks are identified, it is time to identify which adaptation measures can respond to these risks and include them into the adaptation plan once their costs and benefits have been quantified. And finally, it is time to implement these actions and monitor their progress and their results. Look at the costs and benefits. Are they as expected? Are they different? And also collect the feedback from the site teams. They often have a very unique expertise and know-how you can learn from that will inform the adaptation action of the company. And in terms of timeline, so this whole process can be spread out over the course of months and even years. It's actually important to take the time to do this process properly so that everyone in the business understands the final goal, and also it is properly embedded within the business model and the ways of working of the company so that it's the most efficient. In the first semester of this journey, we recommend to do the risk assessment, to define the adaptation appetite of the business. This includes upskilling the key stakeholders who need to be involved so that they understand and they can define the overall goal. That is also when it is good to look at all the different options of adaptation measures that can respond to the material risks, At this step, ECLAIR is actually a tool EcoAct developed that can support in identifying adaptation measures. We'll talk about it a bit more later. And that will be the basis for the adaptation planning. Then in the near to medium term, which is 6 to 18 months, that's when adaptation options should be assessed and quantified. They should be included into the adaptation plan, which also include your timelines, who are the people who are going to be accountable and responsible for each measure or site that is part of your pilot, monitoring cycles, and all resources you might require. And this is also the 1-year period where you want to make sure the adaptation plan is properly integrated within your business processes, that it has a proper governance structure in place, and that it is also reported properly internally and externally. And finally, after this first 18 months, it is time to look at implementation and monitoring, as we mentioned, and this can go on for years. And there is actually a feedback loop that allows you to improve adaptation measures on the sites that are already included and roll it out on other sites or products and business areas. So that is it for me. I will now pass on to Beatriz, who will explain how this can be implemented on a specific site.
Thank you, Morane. So yes, to present to you guys the global methodology that we can apply to a site. We can move on to the next slide, please. So this is our approach in brief. First of all, we look at something that we call exposure. So just the next slide. Yes, we look at the location of the site that we want to analyze. Where is it? Really, its GPS coordinates. To what hazards, to what climate hazard is the site subject to, either today or in the future, and at what intensity. Once we have the exposure part done, so it's all the external factors to the risk of the site, we look at the internal factors, so that's the vulnerability part, regarding its specific characteristics to the site, to this building, to what climate hazards is the site particularly vulnerable to. Has it ever in the past been affected by extreme weather events? If so, which systems of the site were most impacted? Was it the buildings? Was it the people? And then we can also measure another type of vulnerability, the territorial one, because regarding its territory, maybe the vulnerability of the site is reduced because the city or the country has already adaptation measures in place. And then the following step is adaptation. So we look at the resilience capacity of the site. Has it already put in place adaptation measures to the various climate hazards which it is subject to? What are these measures? When are they're planned? And what other measures we could consider if we had unlimited resources? And finally, once we have these 3 steps done, we can analyze the risk. So when we take only exposure and vulnerability, we call it the gross risk. When we take into consideration adaptation measures that are there to reduce the vulnerability of the site, then we call it net risk. It is either effective, so because adaptation measures are already in place or are planned, but then there's also the optimal net risk, which is when we consider all the adaptation measures that we could put in place in an ideal world with unlimited resources. Next slide, please. Then to collect the information regarding vulnerability, so the second step, we usually do it in 2 approaches. First of all, we collect raw data that could help us better understand the past impact on the site. But what is really important is to do field visits so that we can really understand the activity of the site, what were the actual impacts of the past, and really we come with this climate change knowledge, but it's important to know what is the field impression of this events, and how are they already putting control measures, and how are they reacting already today to this extreme events. Next slide, please. And then once we collect these 2 information, so it's all qualitative information, we try to translate it into a quantitative information, which is what we call a vulnerability score. So every data that we collect, we call it indicators of the vulnerability, and each one has a different weighting for us. So for example, if I take a building, for instance, if it has thermal insulation, this is really important to reduce its vulnerability to heat. So it's going to have a bigger weight than, for example, just the type of facade of the building, which also helps, but is less important in terms of vulnerability. So each of these indicators will have a specific weighting. And then regarding the response to this indicator, we have a different rating. So for example, if I take the thermal insulation, if the building is fully insulated, then the vulnerability would be 0. But then if it's partially or it has been insulated, but not regarding the most current norms, then it's going to add a little bit to its vulnerability score. Then we sum all of the scores and we analyze them by hazard and by time frame. So this is the vulnerability, the quantitative analysis that we do. And then, following slide, please. Once we have that, we can, first of all, understand the vulnerability to what hazards and what components of my site are most vulnerable to. So if I take the left graph first, each dot color represents a different component of the site. So equipment, for example, is the black dots. And it has a higher score, so a higher vulnerability score for 2 hazards, so heat and extreme precipitation. Then I can understand directly to which components and to which hazards I must act and quickly. And then the second graph shows the gross risk. So it's when we combine vulnerability and exposure. So if I take an example for the heat, is the blue, it's the bottom part of the graph. So even if the vulnerability is constant, heat exposure is going to increase in the future. So the gross risk is going to increase accordingly. So this is the type of analysis that we can do with this first approach. And then following slide, please. Once we have the gross risk, we start planning this adaptation. So for this site, we saw that machinery and equipment and buildings were the most vulnerable to a certain type of hazard, specifically heat and extreme precipitation. And then we can choose which adaptation actions are going to reduce the vulnerability, since we're talking about adaptation, so we can really work on the exposure part. Then when we put all this on the table, we're going to look at how much it costs. So what level of investment are we talking about, and what level of adaptation action is really proposed? Is it just incremental or structural adaptation? So this can give the site a better understanding to how to prioritize these different actions and to which climate in the future does it have to prepare to. Because if we're going to renovate a building today, we have to keep in mind that we're talking about the climate of plus 4 degrees in the future. So we have to keep in mind the future climate when we're adapting today. And finally, once we have this adaptation plan, next slide, please, we can understand the net risk. So the line chart in the middle shows the difference between gross risk, which is the red line, and the net risk, which is the orange one. So it reduces a bit, our efforts of adaptation reduce our global risk. It may seem like not much, but when we look at the final line chart, where we have the decomposition of exposure and adaptation, we see that the adaptation part really helps keeping the risk lower than it would have been, because exposure is gonna escalate quickly. So it's the efforts of the adaptation that is gonna reduce our vulnerability to then reduce the risk, so that we can have a net risk analysis. So this was the example that we have prepared. I'll let Rylan talk a little bit about our platform that we use to assess the exposure part of this kind of projects.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about the EcoAct climate risk platform and how we use it, and especially the current features as it relates to adaptation. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So the EcoAct climate risk platform is essentially our in-house physical risk modeling and assessment tool. I won't go into all of the technical details of the tool and its capabilities that are kind of described here on the slide, but I do want to just call out a few important points. This is the tool that we use for every climate scenario analysis and physical risk assessment project that we do at EcoAct. And this is the tool that allows us to generate site level insights for our clients' assets through the tool's capabilities of being able to model different physical hazards and indicators under different scenarios and different time horizons. The tool is also capable of doing financial exposure modeling and as well as financial impact modeling. So this is the tool that we use on our projects, and the main value that our clients get from this is the insights for both regulatory reporting purposes as well as internal risk management purposes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the regulatory side of things, and as well as risk management, obviously, stakeholders and companies don't just want to understand what their risks are and what the potential impacts are to their organization. They also want to understand how to adapt to those physical risks as well. So to address this, we've started to build adaptation features into the tool today to start to, or to enable that that risk management piece. So if we go to the next slide, one of the examples, one of the things that we've built into our tool is the ability to download site level fact sheets for individual assets that we are modeling physical risks for. So for example, we might be modeling physical risks for a global company that has offices and industrial facilities and distribution sites and so on and so forth all around the world. And every single one of those sites can download a fact sheet that is able that the company can then use for risk mitigation and management purposes. Now, one of the features of the fact sheets is that it actually lists a list of adaptation actions that the company can take that is specific to the type of asset as well as the hazard that is being managed. So for example, you could download a fact sheet for one of your office locations, and it would produce a list of adaptation actions that you can take based on that asset type, which is an office, and based on how you would use those actions for temperature-related hazards, water-related hazards, wind-related hazards, and so on and so forth. And you could download a fact sheet for a manufacturing site, and it would have a different list of actions because it's also asset specific. So in the future, we plan to build significantly more capabilities within the tool around climate adaptation. But this is a good example of something that already exists within our tool and that we're actively using for our clients today. So thank you. That's it for my part, and I will pass it back to Maria to close us off and facilitate questions.
Thanks, Rylan, and thanks also Morane and Beatriz for taking us through that journey in adaptation. It's great to get, I guess, all the overviews in terms of like, how do we do this on paper? How do we plan for adaptation? And then examples of on-site and how we can then use tools. So we have fair amount of time for questions, and we have some few questions that have come through. So maybe I'll start with a question that maybe goes for Rylan and Morane, is on what practical steps can businesses take to align their climate adaptation strategies with evolving reporting frameworks like CSRD and TCFD? Could one of you want to start, Morane?
Yeah, I can go for it. So yeah, I mean, this question is a bit of a mix between what we both covered, what do the regulations ask for and what practical steps the business can take. I think it's quite aligned. What we presented respond properly to what regulations are asking, such as CSRD, which we're asking for the business to report what actions they're planning to take in terms of climate adaptation, how much of their budget they're planning to allocate to it, and what would be the effectiveness or the expected reduction of risk, right? So following the steps we talked about, this can be done because the adaptation plan actually includes all of the actions. It's supposed to include the quantification of the benefits they could provide. So that can be the reduction of the vulnerability of a site or the overall business to the specific risks we're looking at, reduction of the financial impacts, and also in terms of budget allocated to it, it's what will be the cost of each action listed. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. It does. Rylan, anything to add from the framework perspective and the ever-changing regulatory landscape?
I think Morane touched on the main key points. I think the changing landscape is something to recognize. There are, many countries around the world that are in the process of adopting IFRS S2 regulations, for example, and some modifications are made in that adoption process. So, I talked earlier about the 3 different categories of adaptation actions, which seem to be fairly consistent no matter which framework we're looking at. But I think it is important to continue to monitor the landscape to see if there's, additional requirements that may come up.
Yeah, thanks, Rylan. I think it's we all know from the climate risk disclosure is getting quite tricky with all the different regulations. So it's kind of good to keep an eye and align with all the upcoming frameworks. And I guess it's also worth mentioning there is a plan, I guess, for more guidance on climate adaptation for businesses that we're expecting to come in 2025. So it's worth keeping an eye on kind of that more business-specific guidance, because up to now, like most of the guidance has been at a country level or at a more kind of region level. So moving on, and I guess maybe another question, maybe this time for Beatriz, if you're happy to respond, on how would you recommend that business should effectively implement the monitoring of how successful they've been in embedding adaptation within their decision making?
Yes, of course. I think first thing to look at is how did the financial landscape evolve. So if we quantify all the damages that come from extreme weather events and extrapolate them in the future, we can also calculate how we can reduce this exposure to financial effects in the future. I would think that the first thing to do is that. And then we have also co-benefits from adaptation regarding well-being to the employees, safety measures and resilience aspects of the building, energy efficiency, everything that could come, also reduce fixed costs that could be followed to understand the practical side of the adaptation plan.
Thanks, Bea. Yeah, I think that covers it. And I guess one comment that someone made when talking about climate resilience is that it's very easy to identify when it doesn't work, when the risk happens and the disaster materializes, but it's very difficult to quantify when you benefit from these adaptation measures and resilience. So I guess kind of having good process in place for monitoring, kind of looking at those financial impacts and co-benefits is key and important to have in place. So thanks for that. A question maybe then on the tools that we have available, and specifically maybe on the Eclair tool that Rylan you cover. How does the EcoAct climate risk platform provide actionable insights for prioritizing and managing site level climate risk?
Yeah, good question. So when it comes to prioritizing risk, as I mentioned earlier, fundamentally the assessment tool models site level exposure, financial exposure, and to some extent financial impacts to 28 different acute and chronic hazards that are aligned with TCFD, CSRD frameworks. And as an output of that modeling exercise, that is the fundamental data that you would use to inform how you prioritize which hazards you as an organization need to start managing and adapting against. When it comes to the adaptation side of things, the tool right now, again, is limited to providing a list of adaptation actions that are specific to your asset type and the hazard that you're managing against. And when it comes to additional steps for prioritizing adaptation actions based on their co-benefits or cost of implementation effort, and so on and so forth, we currently do that outside of the system as part of a consulting engagement. And that would be very similar to what Beatriz just walked us through in the implementation example. That said, these are also features that we are continuously building and adding into the platform roadmap, and hope to use the tool to automate some of that work in the future.
Thanks, Rylan. Any additional comments from Beatriz or Morane on this one? If not, we have a couple more questions to go through. Great. So I'll move us on into, I guess, starting to think about adaptation. And we know from recent research and publications that most companies are really just starting to get a good understanding of climate risk and physical risk, and just starting to think about what to do about it, how to manage it, and how to prepare. So I guess the question is, how would you recommend that the company gets really started on that thinking about adaptation? Which teams should be engaged? What's the right way to engage the teams? How to kind of facilitate and embed that within the business? I think you touched a bit on that, Morane, in your section. So maybe if you could cover this question.
Yeah, sure. So the question is how to get started, when to get started, and who, right? Yeah,
exactly.
So I think the good time is now. I mean, I'm not going to say otherwise after all we saw. The effects of climate change are already very real, and all businesses can sense them. So it's good to start now. Now, who should be involved? I think the impulse can come from different places in the business. It could come from the sites already if they have been victim of specific climate hazards. They could raise the issue. Can also come maybe more classically from the sustainable team of your business if you have one. And it can come from the board if they're very aware of this sort of problems, because it's already mentioned a lot in the press. They might want to start acting on it. But anyway, it's really important that the board is involved, that there is proper sponsorship from them, because it is like adaptation is, I mean, impacting all aspects of the business, and very importantly, it needs to be backed up financially, and this comes from the strategic level within the company. In terms of steps, well, if the idea or the willingness to start doesn't come from the board or your CEO, and maybe you're part of operational team or a sustainability team, you might want to start with a business case, building a case for why adaptation is important, which risks you think might impact your business in the short, medium term. And then once you get funding to do a risk assessment, start with the risk assessment, and then move on to the next steps we saw in the presentation.
Thanks, Morane. That's a very comprehensive and very clear response. Maybe if I can ask a follow-up question, which comes from myself really, but I think I saw in your slides a point on kind of internal stakeholder engagement, but also like collaboration and partnership with external partners. And Beatriz mentioned kind of that adaptation at territorial level. I guess any thoughts on how organizations might engage with kind of local partners or local councils on progressing and collaborating on this? Sorry, realize I put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's really important to collaborate with as many stakeholders as a company can, and that can be with other similar companies. And sometimes at local level, it's at local scale, it's really relevant. So we had a client in the agricultural sector, which had issues with droughts,
Mhm.
and all their peers in the same area were victim of droughts as well. So they got together and created a technical cluster where they were debating on what innovations they could be implementing. And sometimes the funding has to be joint among companies so that there is enough funding to develop some specific measures to fight a climate risk. And the private-public collaboration is also key. So at the scale of a territory, for example, to implement desalination solution to provide water to all sorts of businesses that can be agriculture, but also industrial plants. There, it's important that there is communication between the companies suffering and the council. Yeah, these are two sorts of collaborations I can think of.
Yeah, thanks, Morane. That's a great example. Just one final question. Oh, two maybe final questions coming on from the chat. So I think, Beatriz, this one might be for you, but I think you presented on different hazards and different adaptation options. There's a question around how do you identify options which are suitable to cope with multiple hazards at the site level?
Yes. So yes, I think what we presented as a methodology was the first approach before entering really the monitoring and implementing phase. But when we select all this adaptation actions that are possible for a site, we have to put it through a criteria evaluation. So that's precisely when we look at, is it technically feasible? Can we really technically do it? Can we financially do it? And what are the co-benefits from this action? And it's with this third question that we get the answer, how many hazards do I respond to with this action? And it comes also from each year really remeasuring the vulnerability of the site to ensure that its exposure and its vulnerability are really reducing coming from this action. So it comes by monitoring, but also putting all the possibilities through this criteria evaluation of adaptation actions. But first of all, the first exercise is to really think what could possibly be done. So it's more of a ideal and unlimited resources kind of what if situations. But when we put it in place, then we have to analyze financial, technical, and co-benefits of each adaptation measures. Is it clear enough?
Yeah, I think that's very clear. And that covers everything. And maybe links with the final question that's coming through the chat. So maybe Beatriz, if you're happy to keep us started, and then Morane, Rylan, chip in if you want, because I think it will be the final question today. But the question is, so collecting accurate data will lead to more informed decision making, but what comes after this? What could be the actual practical steps be, I guess, in terms of implementation, for example, in an office? So I think, Beatriz, maybe that links to the on-site methodology that you explained. But yeah, kind of like what comes after collecting data and understanding the issues.
Yeah, of course. I think our job in accompanying this kind of company is really do the general photo of the situation, but we're not experts on each subject that we propose. We're not building engineers or energy efficiency engineers, or each type of action needs a more deep level study. So we try to do the roadmap and then help clients deep dive into each actions to see how it can be put in place in practical terms. But I think the first step is really to gather all the information possible and embark people on this journey. This is something that we have as a feedback to every project that we do. At first, people are not really convinced about adaptation needs, and they're feeling already the impact of climate change, but I don't think they connect it quite simply at first. And at the end of the project, they buy into the project and they're ready to put it in place because we have translated it mathematically into a kind of practical roadmap. So yeah, I think these are the two main points: embarking and then deep diving for the following steps.
Yeah, thanks, Beatriz. Morane, Rylan, anything you'd like to add on this final point?
I mean, maybe just an idea when the company is doing the deep dives on a specific site, as the office that the person asking the question mentioned, it might be good to have an action owner that is accountable for implementing this action and defending it and making sure the necessary budget is allocated to it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how basically links with the governance, kind of the strategy, and with the points that Rylan was mentioning at the beginning, and also the realization that you cannot do everything at once, but it's a journey, and like it's kind of about getting started and that engagement and getting people on board. I think Beatriz, you covered that very well, so that's really interesting. Okay, so I think we've covered all the questions in the Q&A. We finished 10 minutes early, which is never a bad thing. Time for a tea or coffee, depending on where you are and your preference. But yeah, just to say thank you very much to everyone for joining us today, and for contributing with your questions to this webinar. It's always interesting to discuss this topic, which we know we need to act on. And thank you very much to Rylan, Morane, and Beatriz for coming, presenting, and answering all the questions. So yeah, thank you very much for joining, and have a nice rest of the day.